The Putin regime isn't going to break from the inside, at least not anytime soon. Only reasonable, if that is the right word, way forward, is to break the Russian military beyond repair. In the late Soviet era, only twice did Moscow's military interrupt the daily lives of ordinary citizens. The first occasion was the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, which went largely unnoticed by many Russians because few knew what was going on. The second was the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which had far greater consequences. For many people, the sight of zinc coffins being flown back from a distant southern country, even as Marxism-Leninism was losing currency at home, shattered the moral foundations of the Soviet project. In 2022, Moscow's military once again interrupted the lives of ordinary citizens with an invasion, and the result has been even worse than either of those previous events. Russia has just lived through the most terrifying year in post-Soviet history. Yet despite growing loss of life and stark moral defeats, there has been no shattering of national foundations. Sure, Russians are becoming divided, and their opinions polarized as people grow tired of war. But far from weakening Putin's hold on power, the special military operation has only strengthened it. Those who fear Putin have either fled the country or are silent. The regime has a formidable arsenal of instruments to deploy against anyone who speaks out or otherwise expresses opposition. It has used the legal system to crush any dissent, handing down Stalinist prison terms to anti-war activists. It has invented its own equivalent of yellow stars to harass, threaten, and intimidate those deemed foreign agents. It has closed down or blocked access to virtually all independent media. And it has pinned the unofficial label of national traitor on anyone who does not express delight at the state's ramping up of repression, the war, and the increasingly personal military police state regime that is driving it. Most Russians have made clear that they prefer to adapt. Even fleeing the country is not necessarily a form of protest. For many, it is simply a pragmatic answer to the problem of how to avoid being killed or becoming a killer. According to opinion surveys, anxiety among Russians reached new heights in 2022, although it returned to more or less tolerable levels when the threat of mobilization temporarily receded. But adaptation has become the overriding Russian trait. Where will it end? For the moment, it seems that there is no limit. Putin is building a new empire, but it is not going well. People are fleeing it in droves. One of the mainstays of the Soviet Empire was grandiloquent communist building projects, but today's emperor has set about restoring Moscow's empire by destroying those same communist projects with Russian missiles. A significant part of the Ukrainian infrastructure that Putin has been attacking was built by his own 20th century predecessors. Consider the Tech 5 power plant in Kharkiv. Built by the Soviets in the 1970s, it provided electricity to millions of people and became Ukraine's second-largest thermal power plant. In September 2022, it was hit by a Russian strike, leaving a fire that raged for weeks and cutting off power to a large swath of the country. It is hard not to see the difference. The previous empire launched the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Putin launches deadly missiles into a neighboring country. This is the difference between soft power, which at a certain stage was characteristic even of the Soviet Union, and Putin's power, which is not at all soft. Still, 2022, a year of war, a year of permanent shock, has done little to change popular acquiescence for the regime. This is not just a defense reflex on the part of ordinary Russians, my country right or wrong, or our leaders know best since they have more information than we do. Instead, it is a double-edged response that seeks to keep reality at bay. On the one hand, it is expressed in desire for vengeance against the enemy, who are no longer even seen as human beings. On the other hand, it is grounded in the fantasy that normal times can continue in a country in which committing violence against outsiders and sacrificing oneself in a heroic death on the battlefield are becoming socially accepted norms. This form of emotional protection explains why most Russians see 2022 as a very difficult year, but less difficult than the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic or the chaos of the early 1990s. According to polls by the independent Levada Center, by the end of 2022, fears of mass repression, arbitrary rule, and a government crackdown had actually receded from a few months earlier. All those tools of tyranny were used with increasing force during the year, and yet people said that they were less concerned about them than before. That declining concern is not only an effect of the pressure to sustain wartime unity, it is a conscious unwillingness to acknowledge that anything has changed, a desire for self-deception. Incidentally, According to polling data, the only major fear that people express at the same high level as previously is the prospect of another world war. That seems to be the only thing average Russians are not deceiving themselves about. A significant part of the population has all but overlooked Putin's violation of the very social contract that he laid down years before the special operation began. From the beginning, officials asserted that they were just military professionals doing their job and promised Russians that, as long as they supported the regime, basic needs would be met and normal life would continue. Now, of course, that promise can no longer hold. Putin requires the nation to share in what he has embarked on, and it turns out he needs the bodies of Russians themselves to offer up in sacrifice. This shift has been justified by the promise that death in this manner will eclipse all their earthly sins. As the Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, once said, "Sometimes the more terrible the lie, and the more outlandish the justification of horrors, the more easily the majority choose to believe it. It helps that many Russians are utterly beholden to the state. According to official statistics, the proportion of social payments in the real incomes of the population is greater now than it was in Soviet times. Despite the emergence of a market economy and a significant class of self-sufficient people, Putin has done everything he can to ensure that the economic role of the state remains as large as possible, and he has used the influx of petrodollars to further that goal. People who depend on the state are obedient, above all politically, and the direction of the Russian economy in recent years has reinforced